I'm just so excited to introduce Dr. Luke Mosley. He's an assistant professor of pediatrics in the Division of Bioethics and Palliative Care at the University of Washington School of Medicine. He works as an attending on the pediatric palliative care team as well as the bioethics consult service at Seattle Children's Hospital. He attended Vanderbilt University for medical school, where he concurrently completed graduate study in philosophy, theology, and ethics. He completed a residency in pediatrics and fellowship in hospice and palliative medicine at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And we're just so happy to hear from him today.
Today I'm hoping to talk about the role that I see narrative and imagination playing in pediatrics. I have no disclosures to share. And I'm going to start today's talk actually with sharing my conclusions. And we're going to work back and all the way back to this by the end. Decision-making in medicine is always more than a discrete decision, and we often risk missing the bigger picture. Narrative helps us better see who our patients are and what the stakes in terms of challenging decisions are. Imagination, as a kind of moral deliberation and dramatic rehearsal, can help envision how patients' stories might continue to unfold. And narrative and imagination provide a different understanding of resolution, a way to potentially avoid conflict, and a reminder to center medical care in the stories of our patients. I'd like to start with the case today. This is the story of Ava. And she is an amalgamation of different clinical cases, families, and scenarios that I've encountered. It's fictional. But I'm meeting Ava in the NICU. She's 5 weeks old. Her mother's pregnancy course had been routine. Delivery was uncomplicated at term. About 6 hours after delivery, Ava developed seizures and respiratory failure. She was ultimately diagnosed with hemimegalencephaly, a rare condition characterized by abnormal overgrowth of one hemisphere of the brain, which results in seizures, some degree of hemiparesis, and typically a spectrum of developmental and intellectual delays. Prognosis can be varied, though as appeared to be in Ava's case, certainly, seizures can often be severe and intractable. When I met her, she remained on extensive anti-seizure therapies and was requiring ongoing invasive respiratory supports. While her seizures had improved over this time, her seizure burden remained pretty severe. The primary team, neurologist, and neurosurgeon were all discussing next steps with the family. They shared a worry that they would not be able to manage Ava's seizures with medications alone in a way that would allow her to safely leave the hospital. They shared that for some patients with hemimegalencephaly, a hemispherectomy procedure could result in better seizure control, either through an endovascular coiling approach or a full surgical resection of the affected side. The team stressed that both procedures were complex and difficult, though had been successful in other patients. And at the same time, they acknowledged that the degree of seizure control that might be expected was uncertain, and surgery could lead to exacerbated motor and visual deficits. Limited data was available to predict neurodevelopmental outcomes, though the team expected Ava would likely be severely affected, either from her seizures themselves or the surgery. The team counseled Ava's family that reasonable options might include proceeding with the surgery, continuing with a trial of medical therapy, seeing if they were able to wean her continuous infusions of medications and see how much they could get, or, given the high degree of uncertainty and how critical Ava's condition was, redirection of care towards comfort and discontinuation of life-sustaining therapies. Ava's family were overwhelmed. None of this had been expected or planned for. They were juggling being at the bedside while also having to go back to work to make ends meet. So they couldn't be here every day, though they were in frequent communication with the team. When asked what they thought about these options, Ava's mom simply said, "I can't even imagine what to do." Cases like these highlight some of the most difficult and important aspects of our work. for many of us, helping guide and support patients through these types of decisions is precisely why we went into practice. As a palliative care physician and clinical ethicist, I find myself thinking a lot about all the complexity that goes into the decisions patients and families are asked to make. In places like Seattle Children's, we take care of so many complicated patients facing serious illness in the midst of really deeply difficult situations. In these scenarios and the decisions we pose to families, it can all feel impossible. Oftentimes, there simply are no good options. And beyond that, in many cases, we're often dealing with the edges of our own medical knowledge, while at the same time trying to provide families with information in a language they don't know that will allow them to make informed decisions. In pediatrics, it can get more convoluted when you add the fact that our patients aren't the ones making their own decisions, and we're asking others to make decisions in their best interest. Given the challenges these types of decisions can all bring, all of us in clinical medicine devote tremendous attention on how to do a good job supporting patients and families in decision making. We focus intensely on what options exist, whether the medical teams have consensus on those options, if family agrees with our recommendations, and when they need to make a choice by. Conflicts can arise in each one of those places, and these situations are often when we, as providers, experience the most complication, distress, and discomfort in our work. And it really is important that we focus on these things. They matter tremendously. But I want to acknowledge a danger. When we focus so intensely on one moment or one thing, it is to our peril. An isolated focus risks missing the world around us, everything around, before, and after this moment. And most importantly, losing focus on the people involved in the decision itself. I'm going to shift metaphors here to explain what I mean. In the midst of difficult decision-making in clinical medicine, we often find ourselves stuck in the rapids. They can be totally all-consuming, and it's all we can focus on. In the swirl of a critical moment of decision-making, we focus on all the things roiling up to the surface, the choices, the questions, the timing, the conflict. And as the water pulls around us in tugs, we search for a way out. We look to the shore, we try to swim against or with the current, and we maybe get dragged underneath. But what we aren't seeing is just as critical. The currents and tides that brought us here, and where the river leads to next. Our presence in the rapids is the result of whatever is upstream. The currents, turns, and twists that brought us here. Upstream of any decision is a complex, vast weaving of the backgrounds of the lives of the people involved. Their identities and their values, their emotions, everything that has shaped their journey long before we got here. We cannot understand where we are or what we are doing unless we know what is upstream. The tangible elements of decision-making are important, but so are the why, the how, and the who of what got us here. So how do we focus on the upstream effects? Here I'd like to turn to the concept of narrative ethics. Think about how it impacts our work and consider how we might employ narrative moving forward. And what do I mean by narrative ethics? It's a way of thinking about ethical dilemmas and moral questions, or put otherwise, what we should do or what we shouldn't do through the tools of storytelling, literature, and metaphor. It is, as the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre said, a recognition that to understand what we should do, we must first understand what stories we are a part of. Narrative ethics calls us to recognize that first and foremost, all of us are in fact ongoing and unfolding stories. Storytelling is the medium and process through which we understand who we are. When we seek to explain who we are, we tell a narrative of where we have come from, of what has happened to us, and how we acted and reacted to the challenges of our life. That's to say, we describe the flow of our life experiences as a plot, where we connect events and patterns of meaning and significance. We identify how, as the main characters, we progress and develop along a journey. This act of storytelling bridges the gap between the discrete occurrence of things in our life along the flow of chronological time with our subjective experience of those things. Joan Didion wrote, "We all tell ourselves stories in order to live." And she meant that these stories we tell about ourselves are not simply a reporting of events that have happened to us, but the ways we create a unified narrative of our experience is in fact what it means to have a sense of what our life is about what matters and who we are. Our story is not a record of facts, but an account of the meaning in our life. The stories we tell are in fact who we are and what our life is and is what it's about. When we think about the storytelling of our lives, we have to pause and recognize that this discussion is not just about our individual stories. The other people in our lives are not simply characters who serve to help the development or progression of our narrative. They are their own singular unfolding stories themselves. They may be a character in my story, but I'm also one in theirs. And when we interact with another person, there's never simply one unfolding story. It's instead a complex intersecting of one person's story with another. Sometimes those intersections may be brief and inconsequential. I personally take a lot of solace in the fact that when I do something incredibly embarrassing, I'm probably just a background character in everyone else's story. Great literature shows us, though, that these points of contact can be transformative. The collision of our story with someone else's may cause a dramatic shift in plot. And so it's never just my story, and in a way, my story is never mine alone. Our narratives are not created in isolation. All our stories are embedded within larger communal stories that extend across time beyond any individual person. These are what we would call the meta-narratives of the cultures, societies, institutions, and traditions that we participate within. To be a citizen of a country is to be a part of a national narrative, or the practice of medicine really is its own collective story of what it means to care for the sick, what being a good doctor looks like, what being a provider looks like, even what patients' roles are. These meta-narratives are the backdrop within which our smaller stories take place. They bring a collection of shared communal understandings of what sorts of characters there are, the kinds of roles that exist, the range of genres we can participate in, and even what might count as a good ending. Within these elements, the meta-narrative sets a stage for our stories to unfold within. All of this comes together as a kind of nesting doll sequence of stories. On the outside are the grand narratives we just described. The inherited narrative gives us a way of understanding and defining what types of stories we know to exist and which of those are good or bad. And contained within that, and in many ways constrained somewhat to the shape of those meta-narratives, we find the stories we construct about who we are, what matters to us individually, what we are doing. In the chain of nesting dolls are the overlapping, intersecting, colliding, and conforming stories that arise as we interact with everyone around us. Each story might bear some resemblance to those outside and inside, but it's also uniquely different. Its story is inside and out. This narrative understanding of who we are has profound implications for how we live. That's to say that it's intrinsically a matter of ethics. The stories we create and participate within help us organize and understand the world. Within a particular plot, we understand things in certain ways, we attend our focus to certain things, while also learning to ignore others. They tell us what's relevant and when we should do something, and they might, like I said, tell us what a good ending could be. Put another way, these stories tell us what we value. They give us a script for what is good and what we hope for, what it means to overcome or succeed. And in doing so, our stories tell us how to act in certain ways. Coming back to McIntyre's point, when we ask what we should do, a look at the stories we are a part of helps us better understand what this question means for us, why it matters, and how it might continue our plots. So let's go back to Ava. Ava's family felt unable to make a choice between continuing medical therapy, surgery, or transitioning to comfort-oriented care. The team had given detailed explanations of the possible benefits and risks of each approach. They assured family that all the options were okay and would be supported by the team. But to her parents, none of these options felt okay. They asked how they could choose any of them. They felt completely paralyzed and asked for time to think. Meanwhile, some team members began to express distress that Ava was stuck and without a choice from the parents. We were all maybe letting her suffer or setting her up for greater morbidities. What if instead, or at least before asking Ava's family what they wanted to do next, we sat and asked them to tell us their story? If we took the time to really investigate what narratives were at play here. In this case, we would hear how Ava's parents, Simon and Aisha, had always dreamed of having a big, loud, and joyful family, a house filled with laughter and lots of activity. Aisha would share how she and Simon met in college when she played soccer, and she'd been excited about sharing their love of competition and camping and hiking and being outdoors with their future kids. Simon would share the story of his own childhood and his mother, whose singular priority had been taking care of him and his brother after Simon's father had died in a car crash when they were young. He described his mom as the embodiment of love and care and comfort, and that he hoped to be even remotely as good of a parent as she had been. But they'd walked a difficult and defeating journey of infertility, and after multiple rounds of IVF, they'd been ecstatic for Ava to come. During the pregnancy, they felt like their story was finally moving forward. They'd overcome so many challenges that had threatened to derail the plot they'd hoped for, but it seemed they were at a turning point in the drama of the past few years, and that this part of the story looked to be nearing a happy conclusion. Now their story felt more like a tragedy. There was no possible outcome here that made sense to them. They couldn't imagine life without Ava, after everything they had overcome. But the life they heard described, intractable seizures, difficult surgery, uncertainty, felt like maybe not a loss of Ava herself, but certainly of the life they had dreamed of and strived for and hoped for. Recall our earlier metaphor. Ava's family are stuck in the rapids. In this snapshot of time, we only see them perhaps frantically swimming back and forth. We may even see confusion or frustration. We may even feel confusion or frustration as we see them, wondering why they don't just pick a direction and swim to the shore or downstream out of the current. But when we attend to the story that brought them here, when we look upstream, we begin to understand things in a broader perspective. Simon, Aisha, and Ava's story, at this point, doesn't give us an easy way out, but it does help reframe our focus. Not narrowly on the decision we're asking of her parents to make, but on them as people. We see them as characters in this story. We understand why they feel the way they do and say what they are saying. We see what's important to them, what they hold as valuable and true. We see how they are facing what appears to be like a complete halting of the plot line of their story. And when we see this, we see why their choice feels impossible, why they feel stuck. It fills the actual realities of their lives into this scenario. It also recenters us on Ava and her parents. In our own stories, informed by all the things we have seen unfold, there's a risk, like I mentioned a moment ago, of feeling frustrated or anxious about their inability to make a decision. Perhaps I've been taking care of other children in the NICU who have been actively declining, and I'm worried and focused on the suffering I could imagine Ava experiencing. Or maybe I was just working in a neurodevelopmental clinic and I saw a number of children thriving at home, and I'm focused on how there can be so much beauty for children with lots of medical complexity. These stories are important for me to recognize and see, and in doing so, help me maybe check a bias as I come to see this family. This isn't my story, it's Ava's. These stories help remind us that clinical decision-making is not just about analyzing information or weighing pros and cons or applying ethical principles. All that matters, yes, but it's also and maybe more about making sense of human lives and helping the ongoing unfolding of their narrative. narrative helps us see the headwaters and currents and perhaps that drew us into the rapids of decision making. But what does it mean to move onward from here? How do we turn our focus downstream? If narrative tells us the story of where we came from, I contend that imagination is the force that helps us explore what is next. And as we chart our course out, we can imagine looking down this stream, maybe outside of the view of this bend, there's a gentle flowing river, maybe there's a waterfall, or maybe it comes out into the ocean. But what is imagination? What do I mean by this, and how do we use it? We all have somewhat of an intuitive understanding of what imagination means, but it's really one of those concepts that's pretty fuzzy when we try to drill down. In everyday language, we sometimes use it to mean that we're fantasizing or playing pretend or engaging in creative thought. A growing body of neuroscientific and developmental psychology evidence, though, indicates that imagine is much, much more than that. Really, it's a fundamental aspect of how we think, learn, and reason. Very young children employ imaginative reasoning as a central way of expanding their understanding of cause and effect in the world. They take their observations of the world around them and apply the rules they see to imagined scenarios to test and explore what might happen in situations that they haven't encountered yet. This is how they learn what to expect of the world around them. Data also shows that when people are actually asked to think about possible decisions, their first impulse is very often to imagine what outcomes could be. It's a central way to how we think and rationalize about questions in our life. And further, studies have shown that the ways we all imagine across people, there are really striking similarities in how we do that, what the content of our imagination is, how it makes us feel. Drawing from this work, as well as philosophy of mind, we can try to sketch out what I mean by imagination. It is one of our fundamental processes of cognition. It's a way we think. When we employ imagination, we create images, visuals, and feelings in our mind. We typically use it as a way to think outside of our present circumstances as a consideration of something different. And like other cognitive processes, like perception and belief, imagination helps us explore the relationship we have with the world and around us. There's an important distinction here, though. Perception and belief are how our mind represent our sensations of the world and understanding of the reality of the world around us. They give us a vision or idea of the actual world, or at least how we think it really is. Our minds don't constrain imagination in the same way. The philosopher Edmund Husserl points to imagination instead being non-real. When we imagine, we don't get an exact replica of real life, nor is it fully dependent upon real life. Imaginative reasoning can break with the rules of reality and be different. This doesn't mean that imagination is totally unreal or fanciful. An imaginative representation may have a high degree of similarity to reality, but it's still very much not our reality. It can be a future projection, a possibility, or simply a different reality to our present. It's non-real, and in this way it's like an alternate or a virtual reality that we're allowed to enter into, look around, think about, and feel. Imagination understood in this way plays two roles. It allows us to transcend our current circumstances, and it instructs us about what a different reality could look like. Because our imagination is free from the rules of the world around us, we are given a license to move beyond what we see and believe the world to be. Here, imagination gives us a creative impulse. It allows us to create fantasies or dreams, or to even consider what might seem like a complete impossibility in the real world. We see this bear out in how imagination spurs on artistic expression, as well as scientific and technological innovation, when we allow ourselves to think of the world not in the way it is, but how it might be differently. This impulse can be tremendously instructive, especially when we imagine scenarios or experiences that are more similar to our actual reality. This allows us to enter into and explore a type of possibility. It can help us evaluate what might be or what the boundaries are of what could be. We use this in simple ways all the time, like when we imagine whether a new couch or a chair will fit in our living room as we're redecorating, or our kids, with much less constraint, imagine the same place occupied by a pool. But we use imagination in this way to instruct us in honestly very literal ways, like what it might look like to move about in our physical space in a different way. In our clinical practice, we see these two roles of imagination can be tremendously helpful and harmful at times. Our imagination may help us think of out-of-the-box solutions to what seem like complete impossibilities. I sometimes think about how truly amazing the surgical repairs for complex congenital heart disease for children with single ventricle physiology are. These reconfigure our anatomy for alternative physiologies, something that almost certainly felt impossible. But because of the work of innovative surgeons daring to imagine something unlike what we know, children who would have died are given a new possibility. I also think about when complex patients are stuck in the hospital for extended periods of time, unable to discharge because there simply isn't a place available that we know of that can manage their needs. And often, when it seems like there's no alternative, our hospital care coordination teams and social work colleagues imagine possibilities that most of us can't even begin to conceive. Managing to find real supporting options, a combination of things we wouldn't have thought to put together that allow patients to leave the hospital in really supporting ways to meet their unique needs. Sometimes, though, our imaginations run wild. It's not all good. A well-appearing and generally healthy teenager comes into the emergency department at 3 a.m., completely terrified, imagining that his eczema patches are actually skin cancer. Or, like when we're taking care of a patient with pneumonia on the general medicine wards. Rounds every morning are filled for an hour with the father asking why they can't discharge yet. And we see that she's still on a significant amount of supplemental oxygen, and we feel a mounting anxiety and distress, imagining that family is going to demand that they leave against medical advice, despite them having not done so. Outside of this, when I consider the context of clinical medicine and decision-making, I believe that we can use imagination very intentionally in some meaningful ways. First, imagination can be used as a different way of moral deliberation. Specifically, it's a way of thinking about what we can and should do that is different than weighing pros and cons, or thinking about rational ethical principles, or balancing what is best against burdens and harms. What our earlier attention to narrative shows us is that when people are confronted with making challenging decisions, we don't approach this in terms of strictly rational or deductive reasoning, or at least not only in that way. Rather, we're in dialogue with our stories and the plots, values, types of characters, and kinds of endings that they bring. We live in nested stories that are better described with literary means. And because of this, we typically frame the dilemmas we face using metaphors and allusions, symbols instead of abstract principles. Just think about a family considering a clinical trial for progressive osteosarcoma. And facing a decision, the family answers with a metaphor: she's a fighter, just like her grandmother. The perspective of narrative is well suited for the application of imagination. As we deliberate what we should do, we draw on the language, metaphors, and context of our stories to envision what the future might hold for us. Our mind can cast a variety of future plot developments or conclusions based on the different ways we might make a decision. We might envision a possibility that is very similar to our current reality, looking at how small things may change or be different, and try to experience what that could feel like. For example, a parent considers moving forward with a G-tube placement for their son, and they're imagining how this will change his experience of being at school with other kids, what it'll feel like, to be different. We might envision, or we might lean into the more fantastic or creative impulses of imagination, creating visions of possible future that break with or dramatically shift with our current reality. I think of a parent sitting in the PICU next to their son who's been intubated for weeks following a devastating neurologic injury, the team who has shared that they don't expect he'll be able to recover from. They find themselves wondering what to do and imagine a scenario where he wakes up and tells them how he's feeling or thinking. This informs how they want to move forward. Within these imagined futures, we can explore what it might mean for characters to work out or act in ways that can provide some type of narrative continuity to their story. It might mean that we are simply open to a new perspective. It might also mean that we look back on our stories and see how the drivers or values that brought us here could look very different in the future. We may see that something that we couldn't imagine at all now seems to shift into focus as right or coherent. Perhaps the most striking example of this is how a parent who has endlessly and tirelessly searched for a cure for their child. Over time, they may come to see things differently. They sought out every option, maybe even like in the scenario we just described, leaning into an image of fighting and battling cancer. Perhaps they begin to envision a future, though, where they're still fighting, but they're fighting for something different. They're fighting for good quality time together, fighting for comfort, fighting for protection from some of the toxicities that they've experienced. They decide to forgo further treatments and instead go home with hospice. This way of moral deliberation is less about deducing the right answer from a set of predetermined rules. It's more about engaging creatively with the stories and metaphors that shape our ethical landscape. We look forward out of the rapids to see where the river might lead us further downstream, an opening up of possibilities. This brings us to the second way I believe imagination can be applied. When we employ this type of moral deliberation through imagination, we create new and different stories to the ones we're currently in. These imagined possibilities show us what we could do or what might happen and who we might become if we were to decide to act in a certain way. I'll say that many of us do this really naturally all the time. This isn't something really complex. Before we enter a clinic room for a difficult conversation, maybe with a challenging patient, at least I often find that I take a moment to run through all the possibilities I can imagine unfolding in that room. What if they ask for this type of treatment that I don't think is right? What if they refuse my recommendations? What if they're too overwhelmed to talk, or angry at this news, or distracted by something all else together and I can't get them to engage? What if I say something that they misunderstand or they take the wrong way? And I rehearse all of these scenarios quickly in my head before stepping through that door, trying to think about what I would do or how I would respond when I'm actually in the room. When we imagine, we don't just think abstractly about those possibilities or what worlds might look like. Because imagination is not just what we believe the world could be. In the process of imagination, our minds create a rich visual representation, and we can see ourselves in it, see what we are like, and even feel it. This isn't just a conceptual framework. Studies of fMRI data show that when we imagine things, the areas of the brain that remember past activities, that help us process visual stimuli, and where we experience emotion are engaged in similar ways to when we experience those things in the present. And so when we imagine future possibilities, we're actually given an opportunity to almost virtually experience it in a really meaningful way. The philosopher Stephen Fessmeyer calls this process a dramatic rehearsal of future stories. The moral deliberation that imagination allows is a kind of reasoning, but it's also a kind of role-playing where we can rehearse new parts or practice different plots. When we imagine these future stories, we're given an opportunity to try it on, simulate it, envision what outcomes or decisions may lead to before we actually do something. As a palliative care physician, one of the most striking examples of this I can think of is when a patient's nearing end of life and a family describes imagining themselves at their child's future funeral. They see themselves grieving and hear themselves speak about their child. And this rehearsal sometimes helps them name the things that they care about, the things they see as most important, the things that they know they will remember about their child the most. What might it look like to lean into imagination applied in these two ways for Ava? As her mother had said when we first met, I can't imagine what is next. When exploring their stories, we saw some of the elements of the narrative they inhabit, of what they saw as a good ending, and the kinds of things that had made them who they are and what they valued. Ava's parents, Simon and Aisha, had dreamed of finally having kids. Aisha had previously envisioned being outdoors with Ava, sharing with her all the things that she and Simon loved to do. Simon had hoped to be the kind of parent his mother was to him, taking care of everything and ensuring Ava was protected and loved. But they couldn't see how any of the options being presented to them right now allowed for those stories to continue. Continuing what we are doing right now, treating seizures as best we could, giving more time, seeing what would happen, felt like a failure to step in for Ava and protect her or take care of everything like Simon described a parent doing, or what a parent should do. Pursuing complex surgeries with uncertain results felt equally complicated, and Aisha worried about trying something that would maybe not help in the way they hoped, or giving them the outcome that they desired. Or even if it did, shared grief that Ava's life still might not look like what they had envisioned. A decision to discontinue life-sustaining therapies and focus on comfort instead seemed impossible to even consider, a loss of the daughter that their entire story was centered on. Drawing on the language and metaphor of Ava and her family's story, we can employ imagination as a moral deliberation and a dramatic rehearsal to help envision what these possible futures might entail. These possibilities for Ava might not resemble the life Simon and Aisha had first seen for themselves moving forwards, but there might nevertheless be some type of coherence to the story that they're in. We can imagine what Ava's story might look like after surgical repair. Perhaps she gains improved seizure control, is able to wean off many of her seizure medications, is able to be extubated. She has global delay and mobility and communication differences, but she reaches stability and is able to discharge home from the hospital. We can see a possible reality where Ava, Simon, and Aisha are together at home, sitting in their backyard in the sun, Ava smiling big as her favorite Disney songs play. And if Aisha were to try this on, she might consider or reconsider that the things she had wanted to do with Ava really weren't about soccer or hiking. They were really about the joy of a family sharing in something they all loved. Alternatively, we might imagine that Simon and Aisha decide to simply hold Ava in their arms, family around them, and ensure that she doesn't feel any pain or discomfort as they move forward with a compassionate extubation. As Simon imagines this in dialogue with his own story, he may see that such an act is in fact a way of protecting Ava and loving her in a way that he could not have envisioned prior. That to do so might be how he lives into the role of being the parent he thinks he should be and wants to be. Imagination in these ways shows how Simon and Aisha have a pathway, a door, that they might in fact be able to imagine and walking through. Let's return to the beginning. I said that we are in peril if we place too intense of a focus on any singular decision or what the options entail, or if there is agreement or conflict. The tools of narrative and imagination, as a kind of moral deliberation and a dramatic rehearsal, give us an ability to zoom out from that. And what do we see when we zoom out? I'd like to finish today with 3 things that come into view when we zoom out. First, an attention to narrative and imagination redefine what we mean by resolution in these scenarios. When we focus on the past and future plot lines here, on what types of characters are involved, and maybe the genre of the story that is being told, who's telling it, and especially when we imagine the range of possible outcomes, we see a bigger story at hand. We zoom out from that singular decision. Using these approaches, when engaging with patients and families, may not give us an answer in a traditional sense. But the ethicist Martha Montello argues that these approaches reframe what resolution even means. It isn't resolution like solving a math problem or finishing a puzzle. It's much more like resolution in music, a progression of notes, a flow, a meter, that all bring about some sense of cohesion to a piece. This type of resolution can provide a lot of freedom when we all feel stuck in a complex decision. It allows us to consider a wider range of options and reevaluate how we see our characters and roles playing out our values. This removes a lot of pressure from finding any specific outcome. Identifying and telling the story at hand and connecting this with the imaginative narratives ahead can help our patients and families, and indeed ourselves, see a progression. This progression might be tragic, or it might be dramatic, it might be comedic, it might lead to flourishing. There can be resolution in all of those things. This kind of resolution helps connect who we see ourselves to be in the past and present, with whom we might want to become in the future. It bridges our past and future stories. And these stories are the real thing, like Joan Didion called out, that give us a life. Second, when we attend to narrative and engage in imagination as a space of moral deliberation in our everyday clinical practice, not just in those moments, but in every day, we open ourselves, our colleagues, our patients, their families to a different, and I would say more full practice. Attention to these things may help us find a different kind of resolution when we are stuck in the rapids, but I will say that it's much easier and better to use these tools before we get to those difficult spots. When we work with our patients through the lens of narrative, we see and participate not just in a singular decision, but in the unfolding stories of our patients. Thoughtfully joining our patients in those stories, we have the power to help shape them with care, humility, and imagination. As we co-write and co-create possible futures for these stories, we have an opportunity to stay away from the rapids. This is not a small point. The resolution these ideas can help us find when we are in challenging circumstances may not give us an answer as much as an understanding. But when we have sensitivity to these things as a way of doing medicine all the time, we may help prevent us all from getting into the worst kinds of challenges. Finally, zooming out from a particular problem or question or decision allows us to refocus on what matters most. Not on the options or the pros or the cons, but on the people who are living in these challenges, the people who are being asked to make these decisions, the people who are facing the impossible. And more importantly, a close attention to the present and future stories of our patients takes the lens that we're using to focus out of our own hands and places it squarely in theirs. This is a recognition that while we play a role in their story, it is their story. Even when we are a major character, these circumstances belong to someone else. The problems at hand and the questions that are raised, the possibilities presented, should be centered within and framed around this story. around their story. It places agency and authority to make those decisions in their hands, to write the next chapter of a story. So I hope with all of this, we can come back to those statements I made in the beginning. Decision-making in medicine is always more than a discrete decision. And we often miss risking the bigger picture. Narrative helps us better see who our patients are and what the stakes in terms of challenging decisions are. And imagination, when we use it as a kind of moral deliberation or a dramatic rehearsal, can help envision how patient stories might continue to unfold. And when we use narrative and when we use imagination in these ways, it can help provide a different kind of resolution, a way to potentially avoid conflict, and it serves as a reminder to center medical care in the stories of our patients. These are my references, but thank you so much. This is my son that you can see as I'm happy to take questions. He was recently very excited about giving his stuffed horse, who I unfortunately called as a joke for so long Edmund Horserole, that now he calls him that, but he likes to give him albuterol treatments. So.
Luke, thank you. That was incredible. And I'm pretty sure you spoke in prose, but it felt like poetry. And I want to just thank you for helping remind me of the humanity in the profession we practice. My question is a practical one. As somebody who embodies this approach that you just described, what advice? I mean, you gave some practical tips throughout, but can you elaborate on how we can make space for this, given the significant headwinds we all face in every day that limit it?
That's the great question, Doug, right? I can say all of this matters, and I can explain why, but what does it actually mean to try to do this, right? And I'll answer in a couple ways. But first, I think it really does just require that we call this out. Because these processes, I truly believe, are always already going on. That when we are talking to patients and families, and when we're asking them to make decisions, this may not be what we are focused on or the way that we're thinking about it. We, in our practice, often are really trying to sort out, like, what is the possible outcome? What does the data show us? How can I convey this to this family? And they are thinking about this in that language of metaphor. And so first, I just think an attention that we are approaching these questions in different ways. And we need to tune our focus to the things that they are saying, hear the language they're using, pick up on the metaphors they're telling us, really inquire about how they're thinking about what the future might look like, and just enter into dialogue on their terms with that language, with this sensitivity. Because I truly think this is always happening already, and we just often are ignoring it. And so it just first is a frame shift in the conversations we're having and the way we enter into dialogue. You know, I, as a palliative care physician, I think I have the benefit often of lots of time to spend asking questions, not about a treatment, but about what's it like at home? Who helps you? Who supports you? And those types of questions often naturally lead to a family sharing their story. And then further questions, as we think about what could be ahead, what they're worried about, what they hope for, often naturally allow us to explore what they're imagining their futures could be like. We just have to have a sensitivity to approach that dialogue in a meaningful way. So that's my first point. It's already happening. We just need to pay attention. Second, I do think that there is likely a lot of room for us to be thoughtful how to foster spaces that encourage imagination. It might be through this dialogue. There's some work by a group in Denmark and the Netherlands who talk about wonder, how we might facilitate wonder in clinical practice, by which they mean taking the time to remove ourselves from the everyday and just honestly marvel at all the remarkable things around us and how that might impact how we think about what's happening. And they've talked about this as a Socratic method, that it is asking really thoughtful and intentional questions to ourselves and to patients and others to draw these things out. So I think it is about dialogue, but I think it is also that we should be crafting really intentional, thoughtful spaces to pursue that, whether it is guided conversation, whether it is guided reflection. All of those things I think can be used in ways to create a space for us to imagine together.
Thanks so much, Luke. I'll sort of like add on to that question. One of the things I was thinking about is you were sort of talking about like using imagination with patients and families about what the future might look like or feel like or be like for them, is this push and pull of I think probably many of us listening sort of feel this responsibility to also make sure that they quote unquote understand the reality. And so how do you, what is our role in constraining imagination alongside families, and how do we balance the healthy sort of imagination that you're describing as that's already happening with that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Amy. And I'll call out again that I am mainly framing how I think we can use this effectively and intentionally, but imaginations run wild all the time in really unhelpful ways. Patients and families imagine things that we know will not be true. We do the same. And I do think those examples where we are maybe in conflict with a patient's family and in disagreement about what the next day may look like, and they express their frustrations, and we begin to imagine how this can all unfold. And just to call, yes, imagination can be a really negative impact here unless we use it thoughtfully. And so we do have a responsibility to constrain it. I think, again, that is where this dialogue really matters so much. That we, in our side of the dialogue, approach this with helping sketch out what those possibilities can look like in realistic ways when that's right. Of if they choose this, what are the elements that we know to be that would impact them? And using our medical knowledge, we have a professional responsibility to provide that information in a really meaningful way to help them sketch out what those imaginative scenarios can be. We do need to do that. I would also just call out, and this is because you call it out a lot, is that often when we worry that families may not understand, it is from the statements they're making, and it's that they aren't imagining in the way we would want them to, not that it is wrong. Or they are thinking about this just in a way we wouldn't choose ourselves. And that can be an effort, or not, it can be unintentional on our side to hold some of the power of decision making and prevent them from engaging in it. So I would just say we need to be sensitive to how we constrain it, though we do have a responsibility for it. That's a really roundabout answer. But.
Hello. I have a question that is not palliative care related, but like the biggest discrepancy in imagination I feel between myself and my patients is early on in the workup of something where they want to know what it is and we want to rule out a bunch of stuff first, and they are frustrated because they're like, well, we still don't know. And then I say, well, I don't want to speak into the universe all the things that it could be until it is something, because I don't want to say it in your child's room, And then 3 days go by and they're like, we still don't have answers. And then on the flip side, someone will say, even when a kid is 9 years old, oh, when he was 2, they said it might be cancer. And so I have a really hard time balancing those two.
Yeah. Great point. Again, I think those are places where, without sensitivity, imagination can really run wild in an unhelpful way. What I would say is that in those moments, it is important that we zoom out, to use that metaphor again. When a family is in that situation and wondering why aren't we answering their question, and we are only thinking about these are the things that we need to rule out, this is how I do it, we're really approaching things in the same way. We have maybe more information to sketch a real life or a closer reality that's possible than they do. There's a knowledge gap or an information discrepancy. But we need to recognize that we're really asking the same questions. Like, what are we trying to evaluate? What are we trying to rule out? What could this be? What could we imagine it to be? And zooming out of that, recognizing we're asking the same thing but in different ways, I would advocate then it requires that good dialogue. It requires that we sit down and have conversation with sensitivity to why they're asking things in the way they are, hearing why they might be worried about something in particular, hearing about how they're framing all of this so that we can answer again on their terms and in their language and in the metaphors that they need.